Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and it's time for episode 2 of the Chaos Dwarfs Q&A. We're not going to waste any time going into it. Just as a quick reminder, you can go back to episode 1 for kind of the preface over where most of this information came from, talking about how we filled in certain gaps, all that stuff. So, without further ado, let's hop into continuing the culture questions about the Chaos Dwarfs. Today's first question: do Chaos Dwarfs ever worship gods or powers outside of Hashut? No. The Chaos Dwarfs have a insanely insular culture and are purely dedicated to Hashut. That being said, there are records of dwarves who have turned to Chaos and made some nasty artifacts or creations. Tordrek Hackheart, for instance, who is the captain, or was the captain, of the terrifying vessel known as the Black Kraken, which was an ally to Count Noctilus and formed part of the Dreadfleet, was a dwarf who turned to Chaos, not one of the actual Dawi Zharr from the Darklands. Though Tordrek made some sort of bargain with the Dark Powers to animate his ship using a demonic essence, which is very on brand for a Chaos Dwarf. Though it's not known or stated who he struck his bargain with out of the Dark Powers. There's also Grugni Ironheart from Vermintide 2, a renegade dwarf who forged a pact with Nurgle and forged the immensely powerful demonic weapon called Blight Reaper. But neither of these individuals were originally Chaos Dwarfs. They're not children of Hashut. They are dwarves who turned to Chaos or made specific pacts during their lifetimes, as opposed to being a part of that empire. When you look at the actual Chaos Dwarfs themselves, there has never been a single instance that is recorded of them turning to another patron or power instead of relying on Hashut. Our next question is, what do the Chaos Dwarfs eat? What do they drink? And do they drink like their Western cousins? So essentially, do they have their own form of agriculture or specific foods and all the stuff that they eat? So this question, from what we can tell, it seems that the Chaos Dwarf diet mainly consists of flesh. The Chaos Dwarfs are foul creatures living in one of the most desolate realms upon the earth. They rely heavily on a diet mostly pulled from their slave stock or various creatures within the Darklands, though it is quite likely they have hidden gardens somewhere in Mingul's Zarnagrund that provide some variety of fruits and vegetables, probably grown on a steady diet of tortured flesh and blood. Hashut is a cruel god that revels immensely in blood sacrifice, cannibalistic feasts, and live sacrifice, which is something the Father of Darkness has passed down to his twisted children. When it comes to drinking, the Dawi Zharr are noted for maintaining a similarity in their consumption of alcoholic beverages, but their version seems to somehow have blood as a major component of this brew. How exactly they create this substance is not recorded, but it is probably a remarkably violent and unpleasant experience. The only other thing that's worth directly noting are the bull centaurs, in that regular Chaos Dwarfs, while they have nasty sharp teeth and seem to enjoy and have no issue with eating the flesh of creatures, they will not resort to eating one another. However, some of their kind do, and those are the bull centaurs. They are explicitly noted as being cannibalistic creatures that have a horrific hunger. And it does stand to evidence that likely what caused the creation of the first bull centaurs may have actually been this cannibalistic greed for flesh. As when the original Dawi who would become the Chaos Dwarves were sealed beneath Uzkalak, they likely, some of them, may have resorted to cannibalism as a means to survive or ward off hunger. We don't have any specifics on it, but due to the fact that only some of the Chaos Dwarfs were selected by Hashut to mutate into bull centaurs, I highly suspect that cannibalism played a key role in that transformation. But we'll discuss the bull centaurs later on. Next up, our third question is, what is the ultimate goal or plan of the Chaos Dwarfs? Quite frankly, world domination. To enslave the entire planet and break every race, nation, and creed under their dark iron tread. The Chaos Dwarfs genuinely believe themselves superior to all forms of life, and that everything exists purely to serve their interests and as resources. It probably doesn't help that their patron god is the god of tyranny. That is one of his most major facets, and that is a huge driving factor in their arrogance and their desire to see everything reduced to either being a resource for them, slaving for them, or simply to be completely and utterly crushed and ground under their feet. Our fourth question for today is, what is Chaos Dwarf beard culture like? So, for this question and a couple we'll be going over later, the Dawi Zharr have maintained a twisted parody of the culture they once shared with their Western kin. They still care immensely about their beards, though it is worth noting the Chaos Dwarfs care for their beards differently. They utilize pretty notable amounts of this really thick oil to keep their beards kind of almost in a moist state that mostly protects it from intense heat. And then the style they often go for is they use these big curls or braid their beards into various styles, which are very unique compared to what you'd see in the World's Edge Mountains. That depending on the station of the Chaos Dwarf in question, they will often shape their beards either to serve as a display or to serve a practical purpose. For those who focus more on style, so more of a display kind of situation, their beards and even their armor are often designed to make them look as fierce and terrifying as possible. They want you to be looking at how horrific they are. They'll design their beards with these upward trailing curls, and their armor will also focus your attention in on their face, and especially where their tusks are. They want you to be intimidated, to be afraid of them. Those who take a more practical approach will usually say demon smiths or the Dawi that have to work with particularly dangerous elements of the Chaos Dwarf society or armies will often have their beards shielded behind, they won't have their beard designed for style. They will be just doing whatever they can to protect it within an iron mask that covers up their beard, or utilizing armor or protective gear to make sure they don't get burned. But should a Chaos Dwarf lose their beard and miraculously survive whatever managed to deal them such damage, they very likely would resign themselves to the Infernal Guard or commit suicide in some fashion. Next up, how do the Chaos Dwarfs feel about themselves? In that, how do they feel about what they have become? And do they feel emotions? The Dawi Zharr have been completely and utterly twisted by chaos down to their deepest roots. The influence of Hashut has greatly exaggerated their disdain for weakness or mercy into utter intolerance, as well as magnifying the natural dwarf weakness of greed into a all-consuming drive. The Chaos Dwarfs are immensely prideful and view themselves as vastly superior in all ways to any other creature on the planet. There is no regret in their black hearts for what they have become, and they find immense delight in the cruel tortures they unleash through their craft. So you could say that they're quite fond of themselves. As for do they feel normal emotions, they kind of do, you could almost say, I guess they have a stunted range of emotions, no pun intended. They feel joy and lust and greed and desire and anger, but they do not feel love. They do not feel compassion. They do not feel empathy, because these are things that in their culture would get you killed or get you ostracized or tortured at the very least. Weakness is not something that is acceptable in any fashion in Chaos Dwarf culture, and they view being someone who tries to assist someone that is weak or helping someone that is in a vulnerable state to be a form of weakness. So their culture just doesn't allow the room for anything that is not a intensely selfish drive, if that makes sense. Moving on, we have a question here that asks, what of the relationship between the Chaos Dwarfs and the Ancestor Gods? Could the Dawi Zharr ever be redeemed? The relationship between the Chaos Dwarfs and the Ancestor Gods is not great. Not great at all. The Chaos Dwarfs hate the Ancestor Gods with the deepest, coldest, most bitter enmity imaginable for one of the Dawi. They will never forgive their ancestral deities for abandoning them, leaving them to suffer a horrific death in the dark depths of Uzkalak. If you know much about dwarfs as a species, forgiveness is not one of their strong suits by any stretch of the imagination, and the Chaos Dwarfs have had their bitterness, hatred, and cruelty dialed up to 11. So I would say with quite a bit of confidence that no, the children of Hashut can never be redeemed, because not a single one of their kind would ever wish to be redeemed. And you can't force someone to become better. They have to genuinely desire it. Alright, this next question is a pretty popular one. What is known about the Chaos Dwarf slavery system? So for this one, it was essentially a bunch of different questions that I kind of combined under this mega umbrella, but I'm going to essentially go through and rapid thought fire through a lot of the smaller aspects implied by this question, and then we can tackle some of the bigger ones at the end. So first is, what would be the perfect slave in the mind of the Chaos Dwarfs? Essentially, Black Orcs if they did not rebel. They would want something that's extremely durable and resistant to, extreme heat, toxins, smoke-heavy air, things that are tough. They also want something that's very, very strong, able to move large loads of heavy metals and earth and be able to work for many, many hours without rest. And then, of course, something that has a laser focus and is intelligent enough to be given orders and be able to fulfill those orders in the way that their slave masters desire, instead of maybe being like an automaton, which you have to be very careful how you word things, or like dealing with ogres or giants, which are often too stupid to really understand what exactly you're wanting them to do. That's why the Black Orcs were attempted in the first place. It just, unfortunately for the Chaos Dwarfs, came with a really nasty backside. But that was the closest they've ever gotten to creating the perfect slave. Next is, do Chaos Dwarfs use monstrous creatures as slaves? Not really. Not in a sense that they make up like a notable part of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. Monsters are very difficult to control and very easily can cause lots of damage. Most captured monsters will be almost immediately slaughtered for use as food or raw materials for other projects. Giants are an exception, we'll talk about later, but they're not used as slaves in the sense that you would not see many of these great beasts down in the mines or around Mingalzar Nagrand or in the slave pits. They're too unwieldy. And it is easier for the Chaos Dwarfs to use large machines. Things such as their massive steam-powered trains, which Drazwath the Ashen was able to weaponize into creating the Iron Demon, stuff like that. They rely, when they need something massive and big, they tend to rely more on mechanical solutions, not monstrous solutions. And it's just so they don't have to deal with the fallout of dealing with monsters. Are there undead slaves? Very rarely, as the Chaos Dwarfs do not possess the knowledge or the ability to sustain such creatures, and undead tend to wear down quite quickly without a necromancer of some sort to keep them running. There is an ogre named Bra the Slave Lord who has a peculiar quirk that allows him to resurrect corpses around him, which he sells as slaves, which is the only time that I've seen any record of the Dawi Zharr purchasing undead slaves. Presumably, the creatures he sells seem to last for a limited time, but they can be very easily controlled and used for unique work that would just instantly kill other slaves. And then our last kind of rapid-fire question is, can you ever earn freedom or authority in the Chaos Dwarf Empire? No. The Chaos Dwarfs see you purely as a resource to be exploited, nothing else. Only the Hobgoblins manage to sort of escape that system, which we'll talk about later on. When it comes to the very popular question of Dark Elves versus Chaos Dwarves and how they handle slavery, let's start with the similarities. Both use slaves as manual labor for tasks they don't wish to do themselves. Both use slaves as a raw resource for blood rituals and crafting horrific magic items. Both trade heavily for slaves and also launch constant raids to acquire more. And both rely so much on slavery that if their supply ever dried up, their empires could very well collapse. There are distinct differences, though. Dark Elves frequently use their slaves as servants in their homes and businesses, whereas to Chaos Dwarfs, they are purely a resource to be exploited and used brutally until death. Dark Elves will also literally enslave anything, including one another, whereas the Chaos Dwarfs have strict quality control, so to speak, as their slaves need to be able to survive the harsh conditions of the mines and pits in the Darklands. They also, the Chaos Dwarfs, have a zero tolerance policy for Skaven slaves of any kind after some bad experiences, and will never, ever enslave another Chaos Dwarf. To do so is strictly forbidden. Lastly, daily life for a slave in the Chaos Dwarf Empire is pretty straightforward. You work until you die, at which point your body and soul will be harvested for further resources until nothing is left but dust. Slaves that prove hardy enough not to die from dehydration, toxic air, starvation, etc., amidst the brutal work in the depths of the labyrinthian mines throughout the Darklands, will be fed and watered maybe once a day, depending on who your overseer is and other various factors. But in most instances, you will sleep, eat, and drink where you work until you die. Some outpost and mining operations may have an unsteady stream of fresh slaves, in which case they'll be more careful to keep theirs alive, but in the best case scenario, they keep you permanently chained up and you'll get to walk out of the mines and tunnels at night to sleep in a crowded cage before being whipped in the morning to get back to it. And that's the best case scenario. Ultimately, though, the Chaos Dwarfs have a terribly sinister motivation for their slaves in that death is not necessarily an escape from their clutches. The Dawi Zharr have devised many methods of capturing souls to be utilized in the binding of demons, essentially using your not-so-immortal soul as a lure or a light snack that will trick unwitting demons into being used for various projects, which is very much a fate worse than death and may last for eternity, depending on how unfortunate you are. So you do want to try and survive as long as you can under the Chaos Dwarfs, or maybe do a good enough job that when you die, they maybe just kind of let you die instead of using your soul as fodder, but the likelihood of that happening is not super great, so, don't get caught. Let's see, another big question here. What is Chaos Dwarf society like? In the sense of, what is the hierarchy of their society? How do they feel about ancestry and family? How do hobgoblins work within their society? Is there royalty or any taboos? Okay, I'm going to start this by tackling the easiest ones first, then I'll swing back to the longer answers. Is there any kind of royalty? Kind of. The Sorcerer Prophets are undeniably the ruling class of the Empire, as they represent the will of Hashut made manifest. But to join the priesthood requires being able to utilize the winds of magic. The highest rank a hobgoblin can achieve is essentially being a slave overseer who is capable of bossing around the other hobgoblins and the other slaves that are put under their control, at which point they'll typically take on the title of a Khan. They're not a real Khan, they just like the name because of its ancestral meaning to hobgoblins as a species. However, the Chaos Dwarfs are not fond of hobgoblins who think themselves too important and will happily murder any uppity ones who get ideas above their station, putting their bodies on display as a warning. So becoming a hobgoblin Khan within the Chaos Dwarf Empire and maintaining that position is actually quite the tricky balancing act. When it comes to taboos, Chaos Dwarf society, as we've mentioned earlier, frowns heavily upon any form of showing mercy or weakness. Furthermore, to disobey or betray a sorcerer prophet is completely forbidden, as they are the voice of Hashut himself, and the Father of Darkness is the one true Lord and Master of the Chaos Dwarfs. Furthermore, oath-breaking and committing blasphemy against Hashut are considered the absolute worst and deepest sins. Those two being you really don't want to commit those two, because your end will not be good. As for ancestry and family, it is important to an extent. While the Chaos Dwarfs do honor ties of kinship and hold close bonds with their families, they abhor weakness to such a drastic extent that an entire family clan can be shamed or lose favor due to the failure of a single member of their family. Thus, they are heavily incentivized to care diligently for their families and ensure that no such stain should mar their bloodline. Ancestry is very much respected among the Chaos Dwarfs in that they consider age to be one of the most important factors when determining the authority possessed by an individual. But unlike the dwarfs of the World's Edge Mountains, the Dawi Zharr do not seem to hold much regard for those who have died. Only the strong will survive, and thus all who die were not favored by Hashut and were weak. Finally, to just be clear, the hierarchy of the Dawi Zharr is quite simple. At the top, very tippy top, is the priesthood of Hashut, made up of the sorcerer prophets and the demon smiths beneath them. These individuals are made up of those among the Chaos Dwarfs who can practice magic, and all evidence that I've ever seen suggests that it's a patriarchal group, so it's all dudes. Next, you have the Bull Centaurs, who are considered the blessed champions of Hashut and act as sacred guardians to the Temple of Hashut, found at the very top of Mingul Zarnagrund. They are deeply trusted by the Sorcerer Prophets, and serve as elite shock cavalry in battle, the greatest of their number elevated to the rank of Taruk. Then, from there, the entirety of the Chaos Dwarf Empire is broken up under the control of the various Sorcerer Prophets, each one of them controlling certain mines, clans of Chaos Dwarfs, and segments of Zarnagrund itself, depending on their rank and authority among the priesthood. Beneath each of those sorcerers, they have their own favored among the Dawi Zharr who owe them allegiance, elevating distinguished individuals to the rank of Lord or Castellan. Then, beneath those two commander types, lie the various elite infantry, warriors, and other roles of import within the capital. Then beneath all the Chaos Dwarfs can be found the Hobgoblins, who are essentially glorified slaves that are allowed to be in charge of overseeing other slaves and avoid the worst physical labors. They're even permitted to join the Dawi Zharr on the fields of battle, though only to serve as scouts, skirmishers, and mostly cannon fodder. Finally, at the absolute bottom are the slaves themselves, along with anyone and everything that comes from outside the Chaos Dwarf Empire itself. So, and just to kind of reiterate, the entire empire of the Chaos Dwarfs is like a big puzzle that's broken apart, or a piece of glass that's shattered, and every single sorcerer prophet gets a piece. But depending on how powerful he is, and how much authority he holds among the priesthood, his piece will get larger, or if he should fail, he might get a smaller piece, or he might get a piece that nobody wants. Bringing back another example, Draswath the Ashen had a unfortunate fall from grace, and as such, he was given control of the Black Fortress, which is not really a role you want. It's essentially the same as being exiled in every way but name, because while he is the Lord of the Black Fortress, it is a very stressful job in that he's constantly defending the Chaos Dwarf Empire from invaders, and is trying to quell monstrous creatures that are waking up constantly in the Darklands, and big hordes of greenskins and ogres, and all sorts of other nasty stuff. Plus, he's very far away from Mingal Zarnagrund, which means he can't really engage in a lot of the political intrigue going on in the capital, and as such cannot change his station in a meaningful way because he's too far away from all the action. Which is a big reason why Draswath the Ashen joined up with Tarmakhan during that invasion towards the Empire, because for Draswath, he saw this as an opportunity to march out and get a whole bunch of slaves and glory in battle, which would elevate him in the ranks of the priesthood, and maybe he could finally get away from the Black Fortress and return to Mingalzar Nagrund in glory. So hopefully that answers that question. Next up, we have a quick question here. Are there any known queer Chaos Dwarfs, or homosexual, or stuff like that? Not on record, no. But considering how skewed their male to female ratio is, I would not be surprised at all if there were a few. The Chaos Dwarfs are cruel bastards, but they take kinship and family extremely serious. So perhaps they have some capacity for love despite their black evil hearts. Next up, what is the average Chaos Dwarf education like? Actually extremely good. The Chaos Dwarfs are not a numerous folk, and thus each one of them is considered quite valuable. Granted, they have no tolerance for weakness, so those who underperform or fail in some fashion will quickly find themselves shipped off to the Infernal Guard or outright murdered if they're truly incompetent. Those who can keep up, though, are treated well, as far as the Dawi Zharr can treat anything well. There are no dregs in their society. If you are somehow surviving and keeping up, then you are probably doing quite well for yourself, and they have quite a bit of respect within their culture and empire, so long as you don't, screw something up. I think we have just enough time to bust out these last three here. How do the Chaos Dwarfs feel about mutations and chaos corruption? So, the Chaos Dwarves in general view mutations as blessings from Hashut himself. So it's a good thing. But generally, such physical manifestations of corruption are very rare among their kind. All Chaos Dwarfs do have the signature tusks, and most of them have gray skin and red eyes. Many of their kind also tend to have small horns jutting from their foreheads. Beyond that, though, a very small percentage will have cloven hooves, And individuals, of course, can have all sorts of bizarre rare mutations. But it is extremely rare, as dwarfs, even Chaos Dwarfs, are quite resistant to the warping influence of chaos. That being said, those that work often with corruptive substances, most notably the Sorcerer Prophets and the Demon Smiths, but especially the Sorcerer Prophets, tend to have all kinds of mutations. Not extreme ones like tentacles or third limbs, but their bodies will often have very dramatic little changes. Like if you see part of their body that start to turn to stone because of their magic, for instance, and it's cracked open, you might see that their blood is literally made out of fire or lava, or they might have weird symbols, or their teeth might be more like wolf fangs, like stuff like that. Plus, bull centaurs are flat out mutants. Like they are just undeniably mutants. And they're viewed as the most blessed and revered warriors of Hashut. So I would safely say mutation and corruption are quite open and welcome. And looking at the time, the last question we have for today is, what's the Chaos Dwarf economy like, and how does it function? Chaos Dwarfs do not have a free society, where all the Dawi Zharr are allowed to wander around doing as they please. Each and every one of them is committed to one of the Sorcerer Prophets' body and soul, doing what they can to serve the will of Hashut. As such, the only real economy within Mingalzar is that of raw resources, slaves, and influence between the various sorcerers. So, their economy, so to speak, isn't so much a market as it is just another bargaining chip within the complicated power dynamics and politics of the priesthood of Hashut that constantly seek to further their own power within the group while supplanting their fellows. So when I say that, I mean that their economy, essentially, you are given what you need to survive, and everyone is taken care of. All of the Chaos Dwarfs are fed and clothed and armed. You don't even get to, buy your own armor. You don't buy your own armor. You don't deal with your own training. You don't buy your own clothes. Those are things provided to you by your Sorcerer Prophet. Those come out of his treasury. He makes the decisions of how you're armed, how you're trained, how you live. That is up to him. You belong to him. And the way he determines that is by his personal successes. So creating terrifying weapons, creating engines of war, having a very successful raid on slaves, gathering rare resources, taking down a powerful monster, getting a hold of exotic materials, securing a very profitable trade with the Warriors of Chaos or the Ogre Kingdoms or something. There are many ways, but your successes essentially allow you more tools and toys with which to kind of manipulate that political structure. But for them, their economy is not what we would understand as an open or free market. It is more like a game where every form of resource is just another piece on the board. And the Dawi Zharr Sorcerer Prophets are constantly looking to acquire and hoard as many of these pieces as they can, mostly so that they can bribe and manipulate and outmaneuver their fellows. Hopefully that's a satisfactory enough answer. And that's going to be it for episode 2. Thank you all so much for joining me. We are getting there with the culture section. I imagine we probably have one more episode of culture, and then we're heading into technology. So thank you all again for watching. I hope you're enjoying the Q&A series, and I'll see you for the next episode. Bye.